Imagine working your tail off for years, sacrificing weekends, sleep, and even your health, only to watch a fresh-faced rookie waltz in and snatch the $65,000 bonus you were promised. That's exactly what happened to me. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Nathaniel Kerrigan, though most people at the office just call me Nate. I'm in my mid-30s, the kind of employee who never makes waves, never shows up late, and always says yes when something needs fixing. For nearly a decade, I'd been the one to hold the team together. When deadlines got impossible, I stayed late. When projects started falling apart, I pulled them back in line. My weekends blurred into endless spreadsheets and reports, and my wife often told me I was married more to my job than to her. Still, I kept telling myself it was worth it. That bonus was the light at the end of the tunnel, the recognition for years of sacrifice. But the day the announcement came, I felt the ground pulled out from under me. The entire department was gathered, coffee cups in hand, waiting for Gerald Monroe, our boss, to speak. I stood near the back, exhausted but hopeful, imagining what I'd finally do once that money hit my account. Maybe take Lydia on the trip I'd been promising, maybe finally pay off the debt I'd ignored. Gerald smiled wide, his voice booming as he praised hard work and dedication, the kind of setup that had my chest swelling with anticipation. And then he said it. The $65,000 performance bonus was going to Chase Turner. Chase. The kid who had been in the company for barely a year. Chase. The rookie who barely understood the systems, who leaned on me more than anyone else, who cut corners and still managed to charm management with his easy grin. The room erupted in polite applause, but I just stood frozen. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. My face burned as coworkers turned to glance at me, some with pity, others quickly looking away. Bigger. Humiliation. All in one breath. Years of sweat and sacrifice had been dismissed in front of everyone, handed over to someone who hadn't earned an ounce of it. That was the moment betrayal sunk its teeth deep into me. Over the years, I became the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. If a deadline slipped, I stayed until the early hours to pull things back on track. When mistakes piled up, I was the one combing through endless details to repair them. If a client threatened to walk, I was called into emergency meetings to smooth things over. I never complained, never asked for recognition. I thought my dedication spoke for itself. But behind that devotion was a cost I tried to ignore. Lydia, my wife, watched me drag myself home night after night, shoulders slumped, eyes barely open. She begged me to slow down, to take weekends off, to remember I had a life outside those office walls. Each time I promised her it was temporary, that the payoff would make it worthwhile. I convinced myself the sacrifice would lead to stability for us both. Then came Chase Turner, the rookie who walked in with nothing but a polished smile and a degree. From the start, he breezed through days while others picked up his slack. Reports half finished, details missed, shortcuts taken, yet somehow his charm masked everything. Management laughed at his jokes, praised his fresh ideas, and brushed aside his errors as if they didn't matter. I watched him grow confident, strutting through the office as though he belonged at the top. One afternoon, I finally voiced my concerns to Gerald Monroe, the man I had trusted for guidance all these years. I laid out the problems, the oversights, the risks no one else seemed to notice. Gerald didn't even let me finish. He leaned back in his chair, gave me that dismissive look, and said words that carved into me deeper than he realized. We're investing in the future, not the past. My years of carrying this place meant nothing. My loyalty, my sacrifices, my health, all of it reduced to a relic they no longer valued. That was the moment clarity hit. I wasn't a partner to them. I wasn't even an asset. I was a placeholder, a tool to be used until they decided someone younger, shinier, and easier to praise could take the spotlight. Every late night, every compromise, every time I chose their needs over my wife's plea, it all suddenly felt like a trap I had walked into willingly. I understood then. I had been the backbone of the company, but they were more than ready to break me without a second thought. I kept my mouth shut. After everything, I wanted to explode, to demand answers, but I forced myself into silence. Outwardly, I looked calm, the same steady presence I had always been. Inside, though, the anger churned like fire under ice. People around me knew what had happened. I caught the sideways glances, the hushed voices that stopped when I walked by. A few offered sympathetic looks, but none dared to stand beside me. Their silence hurt worse than Gerald's words. I had expected betrayal from management, not from the people who had leaned on me for years. Chase, on the other hand, made no effort to hide his triumph. He strutted through the halls, tossing comments about his new car and the trips he was planning. His laugh was louder, his voice carried further, every word a reminder of what I had lost. Each boast chipped away at the patience I clung to, but I gave him nothing in return. No reaction, no crack in the mask. At night, when the office was quiet and my screen reflected my own tired face, the weight of it pressed harder. I wasn't just angry, I was hollowed out. The realization that I was replaceable, disposable, left a bitter taste. Years of sacrifice and trust had amounted to nothing more than a convenient tool they could discard without thought. Yet even as the bitterness consumed me, something else began to grow. The more I watched, the clearer it became. Chase wasn't untouchable. His arrogance blinded him, his incompetence bled through his polished facade. Management could shield him only so long before cracks showed. I started to see openings, places where truth could be revealed if I played it right. So I kept my smile. I nodded during meetings, congratulated him in front of others, pretended his success didn't sting. Beneath that calm exterior, though, I was already planning. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't fight. I would wait, watch, and let the ground beneath them collapse by their own doing. And when it happened, they would never see me coming. I started dissecting his deliverables the way a mechanic inspects an engine, systematically, without drama. What looked tidy at a glance quickly unraveled. Spreadsheets contained totals that didn't reconcile, assumptions were glued into forecasts with no supporting data, and procedural checklists were skipped as if they were optional. Where protocols demanded sign-offs, there were placeholders or vague notes. Where clients expected documented due diligence, there were smudged printouts and half-finished annotations. It wasn't careless mistakes. It was a pattern of cutting corners that would have cost us more than embarrassment if it went unnoticed. Whenever a report landed on my desk, my eye caught what others missed. I fixed formatting, recalculated figures, restored missing attachments, rewrote ambiguous passages. None of it was public-facing work. It was the invisible labor that made everything function. I began archiving each correction. Copies of original files, marked up versions, time-stamped emails where I highlighted issues and proposed fixes. I kept note of verbal promises that never turned into action, of temporary patches Chase applied that later failed under pressure. Each item went into a private ledger. Dates, consequences, potential impact. Gerald's reaction was maddeningly predictable. In meetings, he lauded Chase's initiative and called out creative thinking. When I pointed to inaccuracies or safety lapses, Gerald waved them off as learning curves or enthusiastic experimentation. He seemed invested in a narrative where the newcomer's charisma outweighed practical competence. It looked to me like he had placed a stake on Chase's trajectory, one that, if it paid off, reflected well on Gerald's judgment. If it unraveled, though, the fallout would reach further than just the rookie. The realization hit slow and cold. Their reputations were intertwined. Management's public bets on Chase meant they had skin in the game. That connection presented a vulnerability I could exploit quietly. Rather than calling attention to the mistakes, I cataloged them. I cross-referenced client correspondence with the flawed deliverables. I noted when Chase's shortcuts coincided with moments leadership praised him publicly. The pattern painted a portrait of a house built on shaky supports. Once the picture was clear, a plan began to form. Not a loud confrontation, but a precise, surgical exposure. If I could time the reveal for a high-stakes moment, a contract negotiation, a compliance audit, a major presentation, their reliance on Chase would amplify the consequences. Let the facade stand until it carried enough weight to collapse spectacularly. I would be patient. I would be thorough. And when the structure failed, the cause would be undeniable. They invited us to the conference room with a glossy deck and high expectations. The client flew in, seats filled, tension humming low. I'd spent days shaping the proposal, lining up data, rehearsing answers, rehearsing contingencies. But when the spotlight shifted, the newcomer stepped forward as if born for it. He recited talking points I'd drafted, riffed on strategies I'd tightened, and smiled as the client nodded along. His voice was confident, but beneath the surface I could tell he was brittle. Under the pressure of pointed questions, his pauses lengthened, answers skated over specifics, and a tremor showed when the client pressed for numbers. It was the kind of unraveling you don't notice until it's too late. People clapped when he finished. Our manager stood and offered praise, warm, performative, the sort of public approval that made headlines in office gossip. I didn't expect applause for myself. I expected fairness. Instead, my contributions were swallowed by the show. His triumph felt rehearsed. Mine felt erased. Rather than call him out in front of visiting executives, I catalogued every misstep, every hurried slide and vague justification, storing them away in my head like evidence. Confrontation in that room would have been noise, so I chose silence instead. That evening, when fluorescent lights hummed in empty hallways, something inside me shifted from simmer to lean, precise resolve. I paced the apartment, Lydia's words echoing in my head, her worry over my missing dinners and missed birthdays, until anger cooled into clarity. I didn't want chaos, I wanted consequence. I didn't crave spectacle, I wanted responsibility to find its rightful owner. If they'd built their story around a facade, I'd let the facts do the telling. Over the next days I moved like someone rearranging pieces on a chessboard. I stopped patching problems the moment they left my inbox. I began leaving small, verifiable notes where they would be found at the wrong time. Flagged versions, saved originals, countdowns to compliance deadlines. I nudged processes to expose dependency, routing approvals so that gaps became visible to more than one pair of eyes. I whispered reminders to quiet colleagues and left traceable threads in threads that mattered. Each action was measured, unshowy, and designed to allow the truth to surface without my hand being obvious. I wasn't aiming to humiliate, I was aiming to make them accountable. Their arrogance would do the rest. I drew a line one morning and decided I wouldn't clean up after him anymore. Files arrived on my desk, riddled with gaps, and I let them stay that way. Figures that didn't align, statements without backing, notes missing context. I left them untouched exactly as they came. For the first time in years, I didn't step in to shield anyone. I let the errors carry forward, waiting to see how long it would take before the weight of them caught attention. I adjusted my role in subtle ways. When questions came around the table, I responded only when my name was spoken. I no longer jumped in to cover silence or smooth over confusion. I gave direct answers, then leaned back and let the room carry on. The absence of my quiet interventions created ripples, though most didn't notice at first. He especially seemed convinced he was thriving, his confidence growing louder with each unchecked deliverable. His swagger stretched further, his self-assurance filling spaces where accountability should have been. The leadership team still offered praise, clapping shoulders and encouraging what they thought was progress. Their blindness only made his bravado bloom. I watched it unfold with the patience of someone setting bait, never betraying my thoughts. My face showed nothing but composure, a neutral mask that kept me untouchable. Around me, though, others began shifting uncomfortably. Colleagues whispered in corridors, their glances sharp, sensing patterns they couldn't yet define. They noticed documents arriving late, presentations dragging on with holes in the logic, sudden flurries of last-minute scrambling. The unease in their voices told me they knew something was unraveling, but they couldn't pin down the source. I remained steady, keeping the same polite nods and quiet greetings. My hands stayed clean, my record intact. I didn't need to move pieces anymore. I just needed to let them play their part. The stage was already set, and all I had to do was wait for the moment when appearances collided with reality. The first cracks appeared on the largest account we had taken in years. Deliverables were late, figures didn't reconcile, and proposals landed with inconsistencies glaring enough that even the clients noticed. What should have been a seamless rollout turned into a scramble of excuses. Meetings grew tense, calls ended abruptly, and the trust we'd built over time began to erode. Millions hung in the balance, and every day without resolution pushed the company closer to disaster. Fury from the other side of the table mounted quickly. Messages arrived with harsher tones, contracts wavered on the edge of collapse, and deadlines slipped by unfulfilled. What had started as minor oversights snowballed into something impossible to hide. The team that once moved in rhythm now stumbled under pressure, caught between directives that shifted by the hour and leadership's desperate attempts to hold the line. Gerald rushed from office to office, searching for explanations that never fit, his voice booming with forced confidence. In front of clients, he framed the failures as collective breakdowns, blaming inefficiency, lack of cohesion, or miscommunication. Behind closed doors, he doubled down on his faith in the very person responsible, insisting the rookie only needed more space to prove himself. His insistence sounded thinner each time, but he clung to it like a lifeline. Meanwhile, I had everything catalogued: files with original drafts, notes of corrections, timestamps that revealed how issues had been flagged and dismissed. Each entry was dated, factual, unemotional. It was a ledger of negligence no one could ignore when the moment came. I didn't wave it around, I simply kept it ready, knowing the collapse was accelerating on its own. Around the office, the mood shifted into open suspicion. Conversations no longer hushed when names were mentioned. Colleagues exchanged pointed glances when another deadline slipped or when an update fell apart under scrutiny. Doubt turned into questions spoken aloud. How much longer could this go on? Whispers hardened into acknowledgement. Competence wasn't where the praise had been directed. The illusion was thinning and the pressure made every crack visible. All I had to do was watch as the foundation trembled, waiting for the inevitable fall. The boardroom felt heavier than usual, executives lined along one side, clients stiff and expectant on the other. The presentation started smoothly, but within minutes the cracks widened. Figures contradicted earlier statements, projections lacked sources, and timelines slipped into impossibility. Eyes narrowed, whispers traded across the table. What had been murmurs for weeks now stood plain, undeniable, in front of the very people whose trust kept the company afloat. Gerald leaned forward, his voice booming with reassurance, attempting to cover the gaps with charm and authority. He painted the issues as minor oversights, tried to redirect attention, and spoke of potential rather than performance. Each attempt to shield only sharpened the questions coming back, the skepticism deepening with every vague answer. Beside him, the rookie shifted uncomfortably, the confidence that once seemed unshakable draining fast. When silence finally settled, I slid a folder onto the table. No theatrics, no speeches, just dates, documents, and records. I laid out messages that had gone unanswered, figures corrected but ignored, compliance notes bypassed. The sequence spoke for itself. Warnings raised, opportunities to correct dismissed, shortcuts chosen over responsibility. Every page tied back to moments they had celebrated as wins, exposing what those victories had been built on. The air in the room shifted. Conversations stopped, attention narrowed, and the temperature seemed to drop. Executives studied the material with expressions that hardened by the second. Clients leaned back, arms crossed, watching how the story unraveled. It was no longer a question of efficiency. It was a question of trust, of integrity, of who had been carrying the weight unseen. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to raise my tone. The truth did the speaking for me, each piece of evidence stacking quietly into a verdict no one could dispute. Across the table, Gerald's voice faltered for the first time, excuses thinning until they disappeared altogether. The rookie sat rigid, face pale, stripped of the mask he'd worn so easily. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was judgment. Their illusion shattered in front of the very people they had sought to impress. In that stillness, my revenge landed without a shout, without a threat. It was clean, cold, and devastating. The decision came swiftly. Executives didn't waste time debating what had already been laid bare. Papers were gathered, voices clipped, and the rookie was told to clear his desk before the day ended. No ceremony, no defense left to cling to, just a sharp end to his short-lived ascent. He walked out with nothing but a stunned expression, the echo of his footsteps louder than any of his boasts had ever been. Attention turned to Gerald next. Questions came rapid, each one pointing to moments he had deliberately turned a blind eye, shielding incompetence while dismissing warnings. His attempts to deflect crumbled under the weight of his own past words, now contradicted by evidence in front of everyone. The verdict was unrelenting. He was stripped of authority, moved down into a role far beneath the seat he once occupied. For a man who thrived on control, the humiliation cut deeper than anger. Afterward, the hallways shifted. Colleagues who had once avoided eye contact now stepped forward, their apologies awkward, their admiration heavy with guilt. They spoke of respect, of wishing they had said something sooner, but their words felt distant to me. I listened, I nodded, but I held myself apart. Their silence when it mattered most had already answered questions I would never ask again. Whispers turned into open acknowledgement of where the balance of respect lay. People leaned on me differently, conversations carried new weight when I entered the room. The quiet dismissal I had endured for years evaporated, replaced by recognition I hadn't demanded. I accepted it without pride, without bitterness, simply as fact. In a closed-door meeting, executives laid out their decision. They offered me the position Gerald had lost, authority to shape the team and financial recognition to match. It was everything I had once thought I wanted placed in front of me without conditions. I accepted with the same composure I had shown throughout, no celebration, no outward triumph. Inside there was no rush of victory, only the steady knowledge that patience had done what rage never could. The balance had shifted and I stood where I had always belonged, this time without anyone able to take it away. When the formal offer was placed in front of me, it came with the figure that had started all of this. The same bonus, neatly written into the package as though it might serve as a final patch for everything that had unfolded. I looked at the number for a moment, then slid the page back across the table. My voice stayed even, measured. I didn't need their scraps anymore. What I wanted was stability, authority, and proof that my years of sacrifice wouldn't be brushed aside again. So I laid out terms they hadn't expected. An agreement that secured my role well into the future, compensation tied not to fleeting promises but to sustained responsibility, and the power to rebuild the team in a way that valued substance over charm. They listened and they agreed. It wasn't a plea, it was a negotiation carried on my terms. By the time the paperwork was signed, the office was already different. The ones who had once kept their distance now watched me with a mix of awe and unease. They knew what had happened, how the facade had collapsed, and who had been standing steady when it all fell apart. No one said a word as I walked back through those halls, but silence followed me like a shadow. I didn't smile, didn't raise my chin in triumph. I simply carried on, calm and unshaken, while the absence of noise spoke louder than any applause could have. Gerald had been reduced, the rookie erased, and I had emerged not with anger but with control. Their arrogance had undone them. My patience had finished the work. The revenge was never about shouting, never about spectacle. It was about restoring what they had tried to strip from me: dignity, respect, and the power to decide my own path. As I passed their desks, I felt the weight of their stares, the realization settling in that quiet can cut sharper than rage. My victory wasn't loud. It was devastating. Do you think I was right to refuse that bonus and take control on my own terms, or should I have just accepted it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, stick around for more.